When we invest in ourselves, we all shine. Together, we are Black beyond measure.
Welcome back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. This is our weekly show devoted to exploring ideas and subjects of special importance to people of African descent and to everyone fighting to build a better society. Well, the January 6th Commission here in the United States of America, the Congressional Committee, has wrapped up or is close to wrapping up its deliberations. They've voted to issue a subpoena to Donald Trump, and things seem to be coming to an head. The midterm elections, we're in midterm election season. That too is heating up. And we have a series of very important cases before the Supreme Court, including one on something called the independent state legislature theory. Moore versus Harper is the name of that case. So we thought it would be a good time to invite back to the Black Table one of our very compelling guests, Richard Kreitner, who, if you remember, we had a discussion around his book, Break It Up, Secession, Division, and the Secret History of America's Imperfect Union, published in 2020. Richard Kreitner, who, in addition to being a historian, a journalist, a writer of some great accomplishment, and a columnist in a number of print and electronic media formats, from the New York Times and the New York Daily News to the Boston Globe, to Washington Post, USA Today, and many more places, and who has served as a correspondent and serves as correspondent for The Nation magazine. He's consented to join us again today to put some of this stuff in context as we enter a very transformative, potentially transformative moment in American and world history. Welcome back to the Black Table, Richard.
Thank you so much, Greg. Really appreciate it. And enjoyed our last conversation and looking forward to this one.
Yes, thank you. And before we went live, as we were talking, folks have been responding very positively and getting a lot of feedback to that first conversation. And we're glad that you're back to continue to help us work and walk through the reality in terms of how this country not only was founded and kind of has unfolded, but where we are today and how critical this moment might be. I'm wondering, you have any opening thoughts about the January 6th Commission and, what their work might yield, might not yield? What should our expectations be in terms of, their work?
I mean, at this point, I think we learned a lot, from the committee. The way that they packaged the video and the information that we received was, very powerful, televised viewing. But it might end up being not much more than that. It was kind of, it seemed to me it was sort of part of the whole spectacle aspect of our politics that has kind of landed us where we are now, which is just kind of everybody waiting for that next hit of revelation or information. But where does that really connect to power and to accountability? It really kind of comes down to what happens in the November elections. If Democrats somehow miraculously manage to hold Congress and hold the House, then perhaps something will come of the subpoena of Trump and all the other revelations that have been part of the investigation. If not, it's going to pretty much be seen, I think, historically as kind of an empty gesture and really more of a signal of the lack of accountability in American politics rather than the opposite.
Let me ask you about that, Richard. That's very interesting because I'm sure you've read a lot more of the reports than I have, but the ones I've read, the New York Times, MSNBC, CNN, across the range, seem to be pushing this horse race narrative that says the polls are showing that the election is tightening, the voters are tightening. We saw the early turnout in Georgia is really high, it's up. So, I mean, how are you interpreting these polls? Is it as close as you think? And I'm also, thinking about there was a front page article in the New York Times, maybe it was around the 15th of October, that showed that, so many of the folks who are running on the Republican side are election deniers. And I mean, how should we take these polls seriously? And if so, how do you interpret these polls and what they claim to be kind of forecasting?
I mean, I'm neither a pollster nor an expert polling analyst, so I'm not really sure how we should take the polls. I do know that in the last several election cycles, they've been off considerably for one reason or another. Often they seem to be underrepresenting, Trump voters who are perhaps harder to get, Republican leaning people. But I have no idea how it's going to turn out. I think that structurally you have a midterm election against an incumbent president. Most likely that's going to lead to a bloodbath, and anything short of that is perhaps some kind of victory, even though the only victory will be actually holding power. So I don't exactly know. I do know that, a lot of these people who are running for Secretary of State and for various state positions, were they in power in 2020, they would have certainly voted, they've said so explicitly, to overturn the election, and very likely will again in 2024. So as you said at the top of the program, I think we're in an extremely critical place for the country. And it conceivably could go either way. I fear it's going to go one way, and that's not a good one.
Well, if you don't mind, give us a little preview. You say you fear that it's going to go one way. What do you mean by that?
Well, let's say at a very bare minimum, Republicans take control of the House of Representatives. They're going to shut down the January 6th committee. They're going to open up a committee investigating, Hunter Biden's laptop and various issues, which are, interesting and important, but they don't go to the very core of American democracy. At the most, they could impeach the president on trumped up charges just to get revenge for the impeachment trials of President Trump. They're certainly not going to have enough votes in the Senate to convict and remove him from office. But if Republicans, as also seems quite possible, retake the Senate, then who knows? I very much hope that doesn't happen. Everybody should vote to see that it doesn't. But I think that we need to be looking very seriously at what the last 2 years of President Biden's presidency looks like, his term in office, and what comes next. With all these Republican state officials in charge of the elections for the next presidential cycle, the steal could actually happen this time, and it would be Republicans stealing the presidency, not Democrats.
Yes, as you talk about the Congress, there's been some criticism, of course, within the Republican Party of Kevin McCarthy saying he doesn't go far enough. But then the possibility of Jim Jordan chairing committees, like you said, just these perpetual investigations. And there've been a series of long pieces on folk like Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, who, of course, was considered, quote unquote, a fringe candidate until, of course, she was elected, and now is moving seemingly very steadily toward the center of power in the federal legislature. What is there any precedent for these kind of what at one time might have been considered outlier voices? Well, maybe I'm overstating that. Would they have been considered outlier voices? But certainly now, tell us a little bit. Is there any precedent for these kind of voices before this moment? And how serious should we be thinking about the possibility of folk like that, white Christian nationalists, for example, or Christian nationalists, as Marjorie Taylor Greene calls herself, actually wielding power in the federal legislature?
I mean, there absolutely is. Is there precedent for white Christian nationalists holding power in the United States? Is just the Pope shit in the woods? I mean, I don't know if I can say that on the program, but
that's right.
That's kind of been the rule rather than the exception. For a couple of decades there, it looked like maybe we'd be able to move on from white Christian nationalists holding power in the United States. The disturbing possibility is that we're going to go back to the way things, were in a fairly unchallenged way in the United States up to the Civil War and certainly after the Civil War, segregationists. I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene is, a very postmodern version of all of this, through QAnon and social media and whatnot. But she's, her politics, racism, anti-Semitism is obviously coming up. Fascism, that's kind of been very present in American political history. And I think it's incumbent on us, of course, to resist it in the same way that it was on, say, abolitionists and civil rights heroes to do so then.
Yeah. In fact, do you see some parallels between these previous arcs of resistance to this type of proto-fascist or white Christian nationalist or this kind of oppressive thrust? I mean, what do you take from the organized attempts at resistance now, either through the electoral process or in the streets? I mean, folk just organizing. I mean, and where do those kind of circles meet? We see a lot of voter registration work. We see here on the Black Star Network, Roland Martin has been traveling all over the country, Texas, Georgia, trying to get out the vote, get people to go out, get out and vote. But I mean, are there overlaps? Are there precedents? I mean, do you see some similarities between previous attempts to resist and now?
Oh, certainly. Yeah, I thought at the beginning you were talking about, overlaps between Marjorie Taylor Greene types and those in history.
Oh, yeah. No, and you laid that out. No question.
Yeah. Yeah, well, of course. I mean, there certainly are, especially like I'm always interested in the Underground Railroad and, resistance to slavery before the Civil War. When you've got Roe v. Wade now overturned, I can't remember when we last spoke, if it was before or after the Supreme Court case came down. But, now you've got Roe v. Wade overturned. You have people organizing networks to get people across state lines to services to access reproductive rights that they don't have in their home states. And I think a lot of people are kind of explicitly thinking about that as a modern day Underground Railroad type network. In terms of resistance, yes, of course. I mean, I think a lot of activists, know this today, the way in which their struggle is connected to those of the past. I think it's also important, as I was saying, to recognize the ways in which Marjorie Taylor Greene is nothing new. There's always been a segment in this country that believes that it is only for them. It is not for newer immigrant groups. It is not for people of color. It's not for people who are, non-Christians. So that's always been the case. And where it goes to violence is that they're unwilling to give up power to anybody. They're not going to peacefully cede the control of the government to any other group. And as we saw with the Civil War, as we saw with January 6th, they're willing to go to even violent ends to make sure that doesn't happen.
And maybe as we come to an end of this this segment, maybe if you could say a few more words about this willingness to ignore the concept of rule of law when it doesn't trend in their favor. So many of these candidates, we see it in Arizona. We certainly heard Donald Trump kind of lay this out. I will accept the results of the election if I win. And of course, probably going to ignore the subpoena, or at least they'll be in court. But how serious is this threat to, quote unquote, the concept of rule of law, where people just say, well, I'm just going to ignore the law?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's extremely serious. I think that, we'll talk perhaps later in the program about the independent state legislature theory or doctrine. That is basically setting up some kind of ability to totally ignore federal elections and to just, have the outcome that they set out to have. Trump is obviously an egotist, a megalomaniac, a tyrant in waiting, or a hopeful one. At any rate, he saw a market for his kind of politics among people who also would want to refuse to give up power. So, it's kind of a weird alliance between this, outer borough New Yorker, and, the hinterland, clinging to their guns and religion type people, but they, where it comes out is the same place, which is refusing to give up power anytime they're challenged by somebody else.
Actually, that's perfect. Thank you, Richard. But that's perfect, because when we come back after the break, we're going to get into this independent state legislature theory, or a doctrine, as you say, and really help folk understand what these folks are arguing when it comes to the idea that they can just overturn an election and nobody can stop them. So thank you, Richard Kreitner, for rejoining us here at the Black Table. And when we come back after the break, we're going to talk about a case that is coming before the Supreme Court in its fall docket, Moore versus Harper, what it means and what it could mean. So back in a moment here at the Black Table.
Welcome to Atlanta, one of the most expensive housing markets in America. But rather than help out, Brian Kemp cashed in. He made hundreds of thousands of dollars in real estate. His net worth skyrocketed. And while Atlantans struggled to stay in their homes, Kemp gave $10,000 tax handouts to the richest Georgians and a nearly $700 million no-bid contract to his campaign donor. Brian Kickback Kemp, making Georgia work for him, not you.
I'm Deborah Owens, America's Wealth Coach, and my new show, Get Wealthy, focuses on the things that your financial advisor and bank isn't telling you, but you absolutely need to know. So watch Get Wealthy on the Black Star Network.
When we invest in ourselves, we all shine. Together, we are Black beyond measure.
Welcome back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. I'm your regular host, Greg Carr, joined again by Richard Kreitner, author of Break It Up, and journalist, historian, helping us really understand what's at stake in this moment in American democracy. And when we left, we're about to discuss Moore versus Harper and this question of independent state legislature theory. Richard, we know, of course, that this is a North Carolina case, and the United States Supreme Court is going to decide whether the North Carolina Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court, has the power to strike down the legislature's illegally gerrymandered congressional map for violating the North Carolina Constitution. Now, on its face, it seems like this is a state issue, but of course, they're talking about federal elections. So these legislators in North Carolina, following many others around the country, and perhaps as many as 3 or 4 or 5, hopefully not 5, Supreme Court justices, have this independent state legislature theory, basically saying that state courts and the state constitution is powerless when it comes to federal elections. And could you talk a little bit about what this case means and what is this independent state legislature theory or this independent state legislature doctrine?
Sure. I mean, the Constitution grants to the states, to the state legislature, or acknowledges that the state legislature has the right to set the rules and regulations for federal elections. The question is that reviewable by the state courts? And there's no piece of evidence that suggests that it shouldn't be, the way that everything else that a state legislature does. The independent state legislature doctrine is the idea that the state legislature is independent, partly from the United States government. So it goes back to a very kind of John C. Calhoun inflected federalism, but it's Calhounism on steroids, because it says that what the state legislature does is even beyond the review, as you were saying, of state courts, which is really just completely fictitious, not based on any evidence of even the original founding of the Constitution at the time it was written, where judicial review was already in existence in several, if not all, of the states. So there's really no basis for it. What's really scary, I read a New York Times article recently that said that Republicans have complete control over the state legislatures of states that their electoral votes amount to about 300, maybe 310 electoral college votes, which is more than the 270 that would be required to win a presidential election. So if the Supreme Court rules in Moore versus Harper that state legislatures can set all the rules of presidential elections, even insofar as overruling the democratic outcome of the election and assigning electors to the candidate of their choice, which is to say possibly the Republican one, that Republicans, the Republican Party, would be able to, successfully pull off a coup d'etat in this country of establishing minority rule, overturning the result of the election just by coordinating with one another. And it wouldn't even have to be that all Republican states would have to do this. Only a few swing states, for instance, in the last election and in most elections, since they're fairly close, would have to overthrow the outcome of their election on some kind of false premise or pretense of, voter fraud or some kind of, ballot box failure or something in order to sway the federal election. So I think people could not be paying enough attention to this, because right now we're looking at a path towards permanent minority rule in America under a completely legal, veneer, basically. Yeah. So, January 6th, everybody was outraged. Even Mitch McConnell said, you can't do that. This is the United States. But they're about to try to pull it off in a totally peaceful and even technically legal way. And that's, at least as scary as the guy with the horns running through the U.S. Capitol. This is the real deal here.
Absolutely. And one of the main things we appreciate about your work is its layer and nuance, and you reaching back into history to show how these rhythms continue to unfold. And as you were talking, it reminded me, and I think it'll remind a lot of our viewers who are old enough to remember, of the kind of not roots, but kind of previous iterations of glimpses of this theory. I mean, we both remember, and many of the folks viewing remember Bush versus Gore. And we know that is one of the instances where the federal government, the Supreme Court, interfered in the counting of votes at the state level, the Florida legislature. And of course, while this case, as we know, is about gerrymandering, and I think there are 14 congressional districts in North Carolina, and they gerrymander it so that even if it's 50-50 in the vote, Democrat, Republicans would get as many as 10 seats if voting patterns persist. The Supreme Court injected itself to stop the counting of the vote at the state level in Bush versus Gore. And of course, like you say, January the 1st, 2020, we saw what happened here in DC, And people are trying to draw parallels between that and the attempt of Democrats in the wake of Bush versus Gore to challenge the certification of the vote because the vote was stopped in Florida. But how important is it for us to remember that while this might now emerge full blown, like Athena out of the head of Zeus, like, oh my God, well, no. There are some previous attempts. I mean, you know, help us put this in historical context a little bit. And maybe if you don't mind as well, you know, maybe help us see that some of the current Supreme Court justices have perhaps tipped their hand as to how they might vote in the wake of the 2020 election.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Bush v. Gore stuff is absolutely crucial context to remember here. You know, if you look at this case and you say, oh, the Supreme Court will never go with that, you know, they'll never accept that, they'll never overturn democracy in such a blatant way, I think Bush v. Gore is an excellent reminder that actually they would. And, you know, the Republican Party, the conservative legal movement has been radicalized even in the 25 years since then. So I think there's absolutely no doubt that they would gladly you know, effectuate such a transition to minority rule under the cover of rule of law, as they did in Bush v. Gore. I think that's absolutely crucial. I also think it reminds me of something from way further back in history, you know, from the 1850s, where Abraham Lincoln and others, after the Dred Scott ruling, they're looking at this and they're seeing basically a conspiracy to establish slavery over not just the South, but the North and the West, the whole country, that there was a conspiracy to expand slavery over the whole country and overturn the laws that the northern states had passed abolishing slavery. And he said, you know, it looks like these are all different things. The Kansas-Nebraska Act that opened up the West to slavery where it would have otherwise been illegal. The Dred Scott decision saying that Congress cannot ban slavery from the Western territories. And all these different, you know, items, he says you put it together and you see how they're working together and it adds up to effectually a conspiracy to replace, you know, representative government in the United States with something else, with minority rule. I think if you look over the last 25 years, you see Bush v. Gore, you see, Mitch McConnell's theft of a Supreme Court seat, you know, vacated by Antonin Scalia's death, that Obama, the president of the United States at the time, should have been able to fill. And then you look at January 6th and all the legal theories that have been kind of put out to support that. I think you start to see, I think, a conspiracy. That doesn't make me a conspiracy theorist. You know, sometimes you have to actually be able to connect the dots. And I think we're looking at a conspiracy basically to replace representative governments in the United States with permanent minority rule. And I think that people should not consider that, as we were saying before, unprecedented. I think we should consider it as kind of more of the same, and demanding some kind of active resistance that's perhaps a little more than, you know, January 6th hearings, that looks like something a little more aggressive, I would say, from blue states, from blue cities, and from, you know, multiracial alliances of people, you know, getting in the streets and demanding that, you know, we won't allow it to happen.
Absolutely. And thank you, for bringing up earlier in the first block, the ruling in the Jackson women's health case, when overturning Roe versus Wade, and for making that parallel between that case and going back again to the antebellum United States, the Underground Railroad. And for some people, I think maybe even more so for some Black folk, it's like it kind of rankles. Wait a minute, are you comparing? No, legally, in terms of the political consequences, I think that's a very striking and necessary comparison to kind of shake people out of the pill. So yeah, no, certainly we see people like in Illinois, East St. Louis, Illinois, they're putting abortion clinics, standing them up. So you would need to come over from Missouri if they change the law. I mean, it's absolutely in that vein. Could you talk a little bit about what might be at stake? Let's say, for example, that Republicans do gain control of both houses. Lindsey Graham, for example, the legislation that he proposed that people are kind of fudging on in these debates as it's led up to the midterm. Certainly Herschel Walker kind of retreating a little bit based on the Georgia legislation in terms of abortion. You know, could the Republican Party attempt to mount, certainly if they take the White House too in 2024, a nationwide ban on abortion in your mind? Kind of similar with this Dred Scott thing that Lincoln was afraid of?
Yeah, I think they very likely could, and I think that they certainly will. I was kind of surprised that Lindsey Graham, only a few weeks after the overturning of Roe v. Wade, actually came out with a proposal for a national ban, because it just made the hypocrisy so obvious. You know, for so many years, for 50 years now, they've been saying this is a states' rights issue. And then they get their way, and the Supreme Court returns it to the states, and they say, no, actually, this is a national issue. We're going to ban abortion. You know, within like 3 weeks, to do such a complete roundabout, turnaround about that seemed to me like a particularly striking example of political hypocrisy. The comparison I'm making between the politics of slavery in the 1850s and the politics of abortion today, or just, you know, our divisive politics, is not comparing, you know, the human toll of slavery with anything that we're facing today. It's the political structures of it, the hypocrisy. Like in the same way in the 1850s, Southern slaveholders said this is a states' rights issue, and then they turn around and by the end of the decade, right on the eve of the Civil War, this is actually what breaks the Democratic Party and leads to disunion and the war. The slaveholders say, no, actually, we need a national guarantee that we can take our supposed property across state lines into the Western territories. We need a national guarantee. This is a national issue, even though we've spent the last 50 years saying it's a states' rights issue. And that's what reminds me of today. And I think that the response from those who disagree with that, you know, kind of white Christian nationalist perspective should be the same as it was in the 1850s, which is to say, well, if you now say that's a national issue, we're in favor of being a states' rights issue, to be as hypocritical in turn and, you know, and as opportunistic and to kind of seize on whatever legal doctrines or political positions we need in order to maintain and expand the rights and freedoms that we have. You know, and I think that, you know, as I'm sure we'll talk about later on, I still think only more and more so after the overturning of Roe v. Wade and the possibility of the imposition of permanent minority rule in America, that should go up to and perhaps including secession.
Yeah, that's a good place for us to transition here after the break.
Go make more popcorn, everybody.
Absolutely. No, I mean, it's certainly a striking position, but it certainly has precedent in American history, and it's something we should be taking very seriously. So we're going to come back in a moment with Richard Kreitner here at the Black Table on the Black Star Network, and we will continue this conversation. As you all can see, we're getting deeper and deeper into not only a fascinating conversation of possibilities, but hopefully it's going to spur many of us to action. Back here at the Black Table in a moment.
Welcome to Atlanta, one of the most expensive housing markets in America. But rather than help out, Brian Kemp cashed in. He made hundreds of thousands of dollars in real estate. His net worth skyrocketed. And while Atlantans struggled to stay in their homes, Kemp gave $10,000 tax handouts to the richest Georgians and a nearly $700 million no-bid contract to his campaign donor. Brian kicked back Kemp, making Georgia work for him, not you.
When we invest in ourselves, we're investing in what's next for all of us. Growing, creating, making moves that move us all forward. Together, we are Black beyond measure.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jackie Hood-Martin, and I have a question for you. Ever feel as if your life is teetering and the weight and pressure of the world is consistently on your shoulders? Well, let me tell you, living a balanced life isn't easy. Join me each Tuesday on Black Star Network for A Balanced Life with Dr. Jackie. We'll laugh together, cry together, pull ourselves together, and cheer each other on. So join me for new shows each Tuesday on Black Star Network, A Balanced Life with Dr. Jackie.
Welcome back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. Remember to support the Black Star Network. Join up, download the app, and follow the Black Star Network across all of its platforms. And this is just one of many shows on the network. So support the Black Star Network. We're back with Richard Kreitner, author, scholar, and political commentator in this instance. Hopefully not a prophet, but Then again, I think we're too close to the reality of the situation for us to look away. And Richard, when we left, you brought up the S word, secession, but you didn't bring it up in the context of nativism or Christian nationalism. You almost made it sound patriotic, man. So can you talk a little bit about this? Yeah.
I mean, I think if you look through American history, this is what my book is about, is a lot of the people who think most deeply about what America is and what it should be. Even some of the people who wrote the Constitution and thought that they were trying to make some kind of great nation, even they eventually, some of them at least, started to think about secession when they saw the country going in a direction that they didn't support. And there's a long tradition of secessionists in the United States who proposed either breaking up the country or breaking it down perhaps into smaller pieces that would still be, allied together in some way with some kind of overarching umbrella, but largely separate, for reasons that had nothing to do with the white Christian nationalism that we're talking about, nothing to do with the Confederates, that were actually progressives, though they might not have used that word. Abolitionists, Northern abolitionists, who supported seceding from the Union to protest and undermine the institution of slavery. Northerners during the War of 1812 who thought it was an unjust war and didn't want to go fight and die for what they thought was an unjust cause. So they considered, very, very seriously considered seceding from the United States, either to be an independent country or to join Canada, and form some kind of separate nation. So of course, Black nationalists, as you well know, have supported, various forms of secession and independence, in some cases as a form of reparations, from the Republic of New Africa in the 1960s to even earlier forms of that were allied with the Communist Party in the 1920s. So it's a capacious idea. I argue it's the only truly American idea. The American Revolution, an act of secession, our most crucial political event in our history, the Civil War, of course, over secession. Even if you go all the way back to the Pilgrims, known in their time as separatists, because they wanted to separate from the Church of England and start their own churches, and that's why they left and came to the New World. Secession is kind of in our DNA, as Americans, and I think as we're approaching some kind of legitimacy crisis that I'm talking about, I think inevitably people are going to be thinking and talking about a different form that our country could take that would perhaps be one way to preserve freedom and equality in at least part of the country while we work to retake the rest. It's a dark thought. I don't love it. I'd rather, we were able to kind of summon the resources for some kind of national renewal short of such a radical possibility. But, as I'm saying, I'm a little scared of what's going on in the country. And I think that this needs to be some kind of option of last resort that's at least on the table, and that we should start thinking about and exploring seriously if fascism is truly coming to our entire country.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, it reminds me of something you wrote earlier this year, back in January, for Slate. Imagining a second civil war is a lost cause. And I think you start with this fantasy scenario, this nightmare fantasy scenario in New York City. but as part of that article, I remember, you were critiquing Stephen Marsh's book on the possibility of a civil war, the Canadian writer. And as you're talking, one of the things I remember from the review, you say, I'm certainly not advocating for this. And for everyone who hasn't either purchased yet, or if you've purchased it, haven't yet dug into your book, Break It Up, I strongly encourage you to. And then go back, as you say, and look at your first visit to the table when we had a conversation about that. And thank you for continuing to kind of explore the ideas you explore there. One of the things in the Slate piece that you wrote, you said, I'm not pushing for this. As I sent my manuscript off, I didn't think that I was pushing for a civil war. However, I have to be quite frank, and I'm surprised that Marsh and maybe others don't consider that the alternative is worse. Could you talk a little bit about that? I mean, obviously we're not talking about violence in the streets, but what will be the alternative? We just kind of lay down to this? Yeah,
I mean, the alternative would be submission to the kind of boogeyman suggests it doesn't exist, but to the thing that the January 6th committee and, even your most mainstream Democrats are warning is a very, very real possibility in our future. And the question is, well, what then? What are we going to do about it? In the 1850s, as I keep drawing these parallels, their response was, we're going to stand up for ourselves. We're going to issue counter threats. We're going to say, you know what, we're going to leave the Union if you insist on expanding slavery to the West or even to the northern states that had tried to get rid of it. And if you keep, threatening to overturn federal elections. So I think that our response right now should be the same kind of response, saying, we're only interested in being a part of this union if it's going to be dedicated to becoming, for the first time, really, a multiracial democracy. And we're not interested in paying taxes to, an authoritarian white nationalist dictatorship. I'm personally not. So I think that this kind of active resistance needs to be a part of the democratic blue state rhetorical mix. I'm not happy about that, as you say, but what strikes me about the Civil War discourse, the Stephen Marsh book, a lot of other kinds of pieces and books that have come out, imagining a civil war, is why is it so much easier for us to imagine what a civil war would look like, a second civil war, some kind of like Northern Ireland type troubles where you have explosions, yes, assassinations, and, yes, mass death all the time, which we still, already see a little bit of in mass shootings and whatnot already. Why is it so much easier to imagine what that would look like than to imagine the kind of national renewal that I'm talking about, the kind of national undertaking, perhaps a constitutional convention, to solve our problems, to solve the totally undemocratic electoral college, to abolish the equal representation of the states in the Senate, which allows 11% of, senators representing 11% of the country to block legislation. We should be doing a lot more thinking in that regard and a little less fear-mongering, I think, about what a second civil war would look like. I also think that, some kind of national reckoning or some kind of even national breakup might be the way to avoid a civil war rather than, bring it on. I just think that we need to be thinking now through all these things rather than accusing, when Texans think about secession, everybody on the left freaks out and says it's treason. When Californians think about secession, everybody on the right freaks out and says it's treason. Maybe we're all a little curious about this thing and should, have a more mature conversation about the costs and benefits of staying together.
Absolutely. Could you talk a little bit about that, Richard, in terms of you named two states, which of course seem almost always to be at the heart whenever this is brought up of the conversation, and typically one painted red, one painted blue. But could you talk a little bit about what secession might look like? I mean, you write about this and you've written about this, the possibility of clustering of states, regional formations, and maybe even within states like Texas and California. I'm thinking now particularly about Texas, which isn't as red as we know as it gets painted on the electoral maps on election night, presidential election night. What might some of the what might secession, post-secession look like? Would it be clustering up of states? Would it be, would some states that ostensibly are red perhaps not be as red once that process was undertaken? I mean, talk to us a little bit about what it might be.
Certainly. I mean, I don't pretend to have all the answers about how it would actually work out. I'm interested in the history. But 46% of Texas voted for Joe Biden to be president. So it's not at all a monolithic Republican state. Mm-hmm. So how would you work that out? I really don't know. My idea is that you go bigger and you go smaller at the same time. So you break the country down, not up completely into independent nations, but you break it down into perhaps 8 regions that would take most of the power from the states and the federal government. And then below that, you have, something Thomas Jefferson used the phrase ward republics, roughly county size entities that would, have some degree of autonomy even within their regional formations. And that might lead to some kind of revival of democracy at the more local level. It would mean that we don't have to fight over everything national in Washington, and you would go to these like regional capitals perhaps to do it. I don't have I'm not a political scientist. I don't have a lot of meat to put on those bones, but I do know that it's been a proposal throughout American history, even back to before the creation of the United States, that, maybe one country is too big. And if we were, broken down into more regional formations with the freedom of movement between them, of course, perhaps even subsidized by the federal government or something, maybe that would be a better way to organize things.
Yes. Well, this is a good place for us to pause. And when we come back on the other side of the break, Richard, will continue to play out these possibilities and also maybe spend our last block looking a little less far into the future and about what might have happened in the next 6 months. I mean, certainly with the midterm elections coming up with us. So we'll be back in a moment here at the Black Table on the Black Star Network with Richard Kreitner, author of Break It Up. And we'll see you all on the other side.
Welcome to Atlanta, one of the most expensive housing markets in America. But rather than help out, Brian Kemp cashed in. He made hundreds of thousands of dollars in real estate. His net worth skyrocketed. And while Atlantans struggled to stay in their homes, Kemp gave $10,000 tax handouts to the richest Georgians and a nearly $700 million no-bid contract to his campaign donor, Brian Kickback Kemp, making Georgia work for him, not you.
When we invest in ourselves, we're investing in what's next for all of us. Growing, creating, making moves that move us all forward. Together, we are Black beyond measure.
When you talk about blackness and what happens in Black culture, we're about covering these things that matter to us, speaking to our issues and concerns.
This is a genuine people-powered movement.
There's a lot of stuff that we're not getting. You get it, and you spread the word.
We wish to plead our own cause. Too long have others spoken for us. We cannot tell our own story if we can't pay for it. This is about covering us. Invest in Black-owned media. Your dollars matter. We don't have to keep asking them to cover our stuff. So please support us in what we do, folks. We want to hit 2,000 people, $50 this month, raise $100,000. We're behind 100,000, so we want to hit that. Y'all money makes this possible. Check some money orders. Go to P.O. Box 57196, Washington, D.C. 20037-0196. The Cash App is $RM Unfiltered. PayPal is R Martin Unfiltered. Venmo is RM Unfiltered. Zelle is Roland at RolandSMartin.com.
When we invest in ourselves, we all shine. Together, we are Black beyond measure.
Welcome back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. I'm your regular host, Greg Carr. And remember to support the Black Star Network. And we have dived deeper into the questions that face us as we move into the midterm elections here in the United States with Richard Kreitner, author of Break It Up, historian, thinker. And Richard, like you said, I mean, you and I, we're not political scientists. We're not, trained in that area. But as you were talking, I can't help but think that, one of the things that secession might forestall or prevent would be this minority group getting its hands on the bounty and the apparatus of the federal polity as it currently exists. I'm thinking about foreign policy, I'm thinking about some of the things that are more deeply intertwined, and certainly Mississippi is not going to want to give back all that federal aid, Florida either, which might foment some type of internal struggles in those states, as you say. A lot of people who are not aligned with this kind of minority group politically might finally show their voices in places like Louisiana and other places. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about if there are any lessons we can draw from other places in the world where we've seen people kind of rise up eventually against this type of minority rule or attempts at minority rule. Certainly, we know we're in election season in Brazil, for example. I mean, Brazil might be the most fascinating example for me with Lula da Silva pushing back against Bolsonaro. Any thoughts about anywhere else in the world we might look to for clues as to how a successful people's kind of movement might be able to unfold in terms of electoral politics?
Yeah, sure. I mean, as everybody knows, it's complicated, but I would look at South Africa in the early 1990s.
Oh, yeah.
Where, the anti-apartheid movement finally found some success. And there was a constitutional convention to totally rewrite the Constitution and recreate the country as a way to avoid a civil war. I think that's kind of the most obvious example to me. I don't think we're there yet, obviously, at 50 years of apartheid, and minority rule. But if that's where we're going, then all the tools that, were used by the ANC and by anti-apartheid resistance fighters, I would think should be on the table.
Yes, absolutely. And it's so funny you mentioned that because, of course, their constitution, being one of the most recent in world history, is so inclusive. And, having spent some time in South Africa and taken students there many times, I find it very interesting that American students, and for me, it's been primarily African-American students, but read the South African Constitution and begin to think, wow, this is so much better than ours. And, and yet
press. I mean, what other technologies do we use from 1787? Why is our political technology from 1787? It makes no sense at all. Once you think about it for half a second.
Absolutely. As our friend Gerald Horn often says, why are we still trying to pump life into this flawed 18th century document? But that actually, though, speaks, and you write about this in terms of the difficulty of even cobbling and then holding together this polity we call United States of America. How hard would it be to call a constitutional convention, man?
Well, this is another thing. I mean, this is a whole subject of conversation, but I think that if and when Republicans take power, they are going to be pushing for a constitutional convention.
Oh yeah, please talk about that, because we're not hearing that enough, and it's been written about. Walk us through that. What would that be, Richard?
I mean, well, they've been trying to call a constitutional convention for many years under the Article 5 clause, which allows the states, once I believe it's 2/3 of the states call for a constitutional convention, there will be one. And what they want to do, or what they say they want to do, is limit it. In a very narrow way, that they basically want to pass a balanced budget amendment, is my understanding, which means that Congress could no longer run any kind of deficit, which would totally decimate everything this country does, for people in need, for one thing, and would totally remake the country. And there's a whole, scholarly constitutional debate about whether they would be able to do that, whether they would be able to limit it in that way, or once you call a constitutional convention, as in 1787, is everything up for grabs and they can totally rewrite it. If something happened today, like what happened in 1787, they would indeed totally rewrite it. They would rip up the old one. And worse, they would institute a ratification mechanism or requirement. The Articles of Confederation, America's first constitution, required unanimous consent for any amendment. The founders, the framers, get into Philadelphia, they close all the doors, and they say, actually, we're going to write a whole new constitution, and only 9 states have to ratify it. That again, I mean, I hate to use the word loosely, but that's a coup d'etat. If that were to happen today, if the Koch brothers and all the richest people in America were to get into a room and say, we're going to rip up the Constitution, we're going to drop a new one, and only, so many states need to ratify it, that would be called a coup d'etat. So I think that, but I think that they're pushing for it so hard that I think it's very likely to actually happen in our lifetimes, probably in the next 5 to 10 years. And I think that it is irresponsible of Democrats, of the left, of anybody who opposes what that side wants to do, to withdraw from the effort and say we're against a constitutional convention entirely. I think that this is really, it could be a real rallying point for people across the country to kind of revive democracy and really summon, what you're saying Gerald Horn talks about, like really summon kind of a sense of responsibility for ourselves and our own political system, a sense that we can recreate our politics in our own image and for our own needs in our own time, that we're not beholden to one from the 18th century, and that doesn't mean we're all going to agree. It doesn't mean it's all going to look good. And I think it should all be put on television rather than in secret as last time. But I really think it's kind of our only hope for reviving American democracy. And rather than fighting this kind of constant rearguard effort against right-wing efforts to undermine the Constitution, it's time for a new one.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, as we kind of turn toward the close of our time together this time around, I'm wondering if you might train your eye on the next half year or so. Certainly by then, we'll probably have, by early 23 or sometimes in 23, decision in the Moore case. While it takes 5 votes to win a case at the Supreme Court, at least unless they expand the court. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that at some point in the future, but 4 private votes is enough to take a case. And of course, many legal observers are like, why would you even take a case like this? This is absurd. But clearly 4 votes, they had 4 votes to get it to the Supreme Court. How do you see the next 6 months or so playing out? I mean, any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, again, it all depends on November. What happens in November. I think what's likely to happen is Republicans take the House, and it's kind of a toss-up in the Senate. It could go either way. Either way, we're looking at dysfunctional politics, which is a very familiar place for anybody who's been paying attention for the last 15 years, is a government that's effectively unable to function, not able to act on climate change, not able to act on gun rights or abortion, or really even economic issues. I mean, I kind of wish Democrats were doing a better job connecting all these different pieces of, the future of democracy and bread and butter issues, like why are there no high-paying jobs? Why is inflation so bad? A lot of that is because it's become effectively an ungovernable country. We can't pass legislation raising taxes on the rich or doing any things that would really help working people out because of all these anti-democratic mechanisms in our Constitution. So it's all connected in a way that I think very few Democratic politicians or even really thought leaders or whatever are doing or showing. So I think that we're very likely to end up in 6 months. What would that be? April? Maybe the court will have ruled or not. I'm not sure.
No,
but in any case, the facts of the matter will remain that you have an insurgent anti-democratic movement in this country taking advantage of provisions in our Constitution and our political system that have always been there, that are only now really being weaponized for, not only now, because it's happened before, as I said, but for truly fascistic purposes. And you have a democratic resistance that I think is fairly weak-kneed and isn't really addressing the magnitude of the problem. So in 2023, I hope, but don't expect necessarily to see people really recognizing how serious the situation is and considering, remedies that they might not have otherwise allowed themselves to consider for what we should do if everything really, falls.
Absolutely. It's funny, you were talking, I'm reminded of some of the folks in this country and beyond who are, I guess they would be considered to be on the far left, who envision a scenario like that, where options that we wouldn't normally consider are ones that we might begin to consider. And they almost relish the possibility of that. And I keep thinking to myself, y'all must not never have been in a real fight like that, because that's, you've written about it and you certainly have opined about it and talked about it again today. Those are very real consequences. I mean, we're talking about violence and maybe not even organized violence. I mean, so, with perhaps an opportunity to kind of forestall something like that unfolding, how important is it for people to get out here and vote in these midterm elections? And finally, in the context of the January 6th commission and the reports that people's opinions haven't really budged either one way or the other in the wake of these findings, these revelations, going back to what you said in the first block about this being, very informative, but necessarily not maybe having much of an impact. How important is it for folk to get off their behinds and go out here and perhaps participate in something that they would prefer to the alternative?
I mean, it's a cliche, but I think it's never been more important. History just keeps unfolding kind of. And for somebody my age, it keeps getting worse, honestly, which makes voting more and more important. That's our only hope really is I think to hold Congress in the hands. I don't care about the Democratic Party. I care about small d Democrats, to hold Congress in the hands of people who care about democracy and who think that the outcome of an election should even matter. Because there's a whole nother side to the equation these days, which doesn't even agree with that basic premise. They'll run around saying we're not a democracy, we're a republic, and increasingly explicitly putting down the idea that the people should get to choose their rulers. And that's an extremely alarming situation. I don't want violence. I'm not a violent person, as you might be able to tell. And that piece that I wrote is explicitly talking about, my own fears that my own work has, raised in my subconscious and unconscious mind. So I don't want violence either. I do know that when you look through history, people need to stand up for their rights. And without that, they're going to be taken away. So we should certainly do everything possible to avoid that kind of situation. But I think people need to be prepared to stand up and defend their rights in a way that for a couple years there, maybe we got a little complacent and felt like it wasn't really necessary anymore. I think the lesson of the 21st century is going to be that it still very much is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so before we go, I must mention again, if you haven't purchased and read Break It Up, Secession, Division, and the Secret History of America's Imperfect Union from 2020. Please, you all need to do that. And as a fellow book person, certainly booked A Traveler's Guide to Literary Locations Around the World. We had to have you back one time. We just talk about that. Reading is fundamental. I gotta ask you one final question. How's that project coming on about the Civil War, man, and slavery, Jews in the Civil War?
It's good, man. You can imagine I've been glued to the news the last week or two,
Oh, Kanye. Yes, indeed.
but it's rich terrain. All that shows to me is it's rich terrain. Jews, whiteness, African Americans, civil rights, the Civil War, slavery. That's all. There's lots to still unpack there. No
question.
So it's coming along. I appreciate you asking.
No, of course. And in fact, like you said, who could have anticipated? Well, I guess anybody who gives Kanye West a hot microphone could have predicted what was going on.
But it's also not him. It's Tucker. It's Trump. I mean,
no question. Well,
normalization going on right now. That's just incredibly pernicious and wrapped up in everything else that we're talking about.
That's exactly right. And thank you. Right. Kanye is just like a face of it, but right behind him, all of that long history of anti-Semitism in this country, like you say, Trump, Tucker Carlson, and the arc in which they are working, which is a terrible, long, and sadly very familiar arc. So, so if folk want to and should, reach out and read some of your writings and kind of connect, it's richardkreitner.com, right?
That's right.
All right. KREITNER, richardkreitner.com. Richard, Thank you for joining us again, man. I hope you'll come back soon and we can continue this conversation. Hopefully, after humanity triumphs over the niggling and terrible impulses that we can sometimes manifest, we can go back.
Everybody votes, as you say,
Everybody votes, no question. As long as everybody does that, we might be able to do this. Thanks for joining us again, Richard. And when we come back in a moment, we're going to clear the table and prepare for our next session here at the Black Table. Back in a moment.
When we invest in ourselves, we all shine. Together, we are Black beyond measure.
Welcome to Atlanta, one of the most expensive housing markets in America. But rather than help out, Brian Kemp cashed in. He made hundreds of thousands of dollars in real estate. His net worth skyrocketed. And while Atlantans struggled to stay in their homes, Kemp gave $10,000 tax handouts to the richest Georgians and a nearly $700 million no-bid contract to his campaign donor. Brian Kickback Kemp, making Georgia work for him, not you.
Hatred on the streets, a horrific scene, a white nationalist rally that descended into deadly violence.
White people are losing their damn minds.
As an angry pro-Trump mob storms the U.S. Capitol, we've seen shots.
We're about to see the rise of what I call white minority resistance. We have seen white folks in this country who simply cannot tolerate black folks voting.
I think what we're seeing is the inevitable result of violent denial.
This is part of American history. Every time that people of color have made progress, whether real or symbolic, there has been what Carol Anderson at Emory University calls white rage as a backlash.
This is the rise of the Proud Boys and the Boogaloo Boys. America, there's going to be more of this.
Here's all the Proud Boys, guys.
This country is getting increasingly racist in its behaviors and its attitudes because of the fear of white people.
The fear that they're taking our jobs, they're taking our resources, they're taking our women. This is white fear.
Welcome back to the Black Table on the Black Star Network. Remember to support the Black Star Network, download the app and subscribe, and make sure that you don't miss any of the shows that are on this network. We want to thank Richard Kreitner for joining us again here at the table. And as you can tell from the last hour we've spent discussing what's at stake with the coming midterm elections, what might not be at stake in terms of what people may or may not have gotten from the January 6th commission, what's at stake at the Supreme Court in the United States with the Moore versus Harper case, which is just one among many that we should be paying attention to and be very concerned about. We understand ultimately, as we heard Richard say there at the end, that if you're going to live in a society, you need to live in a society. That means you need to participate. You need to make your voice heard. You need to combine with others of good faith and goodwill. We need to break the back of things like proto-fascism, white nationalism, any forms of nativism, any forms of oppressive public policy, potential public policy that could merely make things terrible for us in not only this country, but in the world. So we're glad you joined us here at the Black Table, and we'll see you next week with our regular conversation. Thank you.
When we invest in ourselves, we all shine. Together, we are Black beyond measure.
When you talk about blackness and what happens in Black culture, we're about covering these things that matter to us, speaking to our issues and concerns.
This is a genuine people-powered movement.
There's a lot of stuff that we're not getting. You get it, and you spread the word.
We wish to plead our own cause, to long have others spoken for us. We cannot tell our own story if we can't pay for it. This is about covering us. Invest in Black-owned media. Your dollars matter. We don't have to keep asking them to cover our stuff. So please support us in what we do, folks. We want to hit 2,000 people, $50 this month, raise $100,000. We're behind 100,000, so we want to hit that. Y'all money makes this possible. Checks and money orders go to P.O. Box 57196, Washington, D.C. 20037-0196. The Cash App is $RM Unfiltered. PayPal is R Martin Unfiltered. Venmo is RM Unfiltered. Zelle is Roland@RolandSMartin.com.